It's Thursday, February 6th. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. In the face of tariff threats and a shifting economic landscape, today in the show, we're going to bring you a discussion on local investment, small business development, and local ownership. Here's our question. How should we adapt for the short, medium, and long term? So, folks, we're marching our way through that 30-day reprieve from the U.S. Tariff threats, right, from the U.S. president. And who knows what else will be thrown at us over some kind of a social media, whether it's an X or one of the other platforms used to be called tweets. One thing's for sure, though, there's a lot of uncertainty at the moment, plus a whole range of feelings, right? So if you want to join the conversation, right, that question I asked about the economy here, right, about businesses here, how should we adapt for the short, medium, and long term? The lines are open through the show today, 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. Text us, 709-327-8206. Emails thesignal@cbc.ca. I've got two guests in studio, Chelsey MacNeil, CEO of the Purposeful Group, and Russell Williams, poli-sci prof. And Russell, I was looking at your MUN little blurb at the university, and it's Canadian economic development is one of your specialties, Canadian foreign policy and international political economy, globalization, financial services, and Canadian public policy. Also, trade policy and regional integration. But here's my first question for you. With all of that, this feels really different. Does any of that matter for what you've studied before, given what is happening now?
Wow, that's a big lead-in. So, got to be careful what you put on the internet.
Yeah, it'll be changed tomorrow, right?
Yeah. So, the Canada-U.S. trade relationship, trade disputes, was something I spent a lot of my life studying. And I had a particular interest in softwood lumber dispute, which was an area, a relatively important sector in Canada, but an isolated sector that was particularly important to British Columbia and in particular to Vancouver Island, where I grew up, in which the United States periodically put something like 20% tariffs on that sector. And, we knew how devastating that was for that industry. But that was a really particular problem that we've had to manage in the bilateral relationship. To suddenly be in an environment where we're saying we're going to do that, but we're going to do it to the whole economy, was just out of scale with anything we've seen in the past. And the fact that it's still out there, I suspect the issue is going to go away now. That's normally how trade politics work. But, as you were alluding to, given the social media dimensions of this particular crisis, it's very hard to predict the future. It's very hard to predict the next 10 minutes in politics at the moment. This was a seismic shock for the people who think about Canadian policy, Canadian trade policy, our international economic relationships, and that's why we need to have this serious discussion about the long term, right? What can we do to insulate ourselves a little better from the discretionary use of U.S. policy in ways that really hurt Canadians and the Canadian economy?
I was going to read a tweet, but I will now look for it. Do we call them X's? I can never keep track. Anyways, I'll get back to it later. It was on my screen. It is now. Oh, here it is. Brian Stelter, right, with reliable sources for CNN. So his lead this morning because Brian is he's the chief media analyst for CNN. It says, journalists are in the business of covering reality, but we keep getting sucked into covering President Trump's unreality because of his position and power, right? So he says the unreality is a continual challenge for fact checkers and the wider media. Journalists don't have to spend all day debunking Trump stuff, but we do have to recognize that it's time consuming, that it's consuming the feeds of fans of Donald Trump. So, Chelsey, for yourself, right, as this lead up into, and we'll get, because you put a post up on LinkedIn about all this, this lead up to the tariff threats and this uncertainty that is here. Plus, when you think of what I just said with Brian there and just talking about, I guess, the fire hose of info that is coming at us, what's it like for someone like yourself when you're thinking about the well-being of the economy and businesses in Newfoundland and Labrador?
Yeah, I think, when people are looking at business or developing businesses or scaling businesses, they're always looking to the future. And when that future feels really uncertain, all of a sudden the ambition changes, the opportunities look different, the stakes change. And when we have this global uncertainty, when we have this, I think, pressure coming from across the border and really what could completely change the face of the Canadian economy, it's no doubt that all of a sudden the sands start shifting under your feet and you start making different decisions. I mean, it's very real that the question, in the face of these tariffs, do companies move across the border? Does investment just stop? And if we think about businesses, large, medium-sized, or even small, these investment decisions drive how businesses, I think, connect with their communities, but it also shows up on our shelves, in our amenities, in our communities. So we as consumers feel that uncertainty in very real ways very quickly. And Newfoundland and Labrador in particular, we are really vulnerable to those big shifts and the changes in the economic landscape. And we see it on our grocery shelves. And that's where it hits people in the pocketbooks. And business plays an important role in that in the way in which our societies, how we live every day, and how our governments then create policy and how we incentivize. I don't know if we can work fast enough for this Canada-U.S. relations, even though businesses are agile. But I worry that the chaos is actually creating chaos subsequently in the business communities from on a micro scale to a macro scale.
Because some of that is it makes me think of there's the transition that's going on from carbon to what comes next, right? In this province, we've taken a good look at our healthcare system. We're trying to reinvent that. Point being, as we look at this, depending on tariffs or not, there's thoughts around reinvention happening. Reinvention takes time. Mm-hmm. And with reinvention comes setbacks. But when you're looking at small, medium businesses in Newfoundland and Labrador, what could the losses be if we really have to keep going down this road of reinvention and reimagining an economy or Canadian or provincial economy without this close relationship to the United States? Russell, when it comes to that, what are your thoughts? Because this hasn't happened before, in modern times.
We haven't had a debate about sort of national economic policy in Canada since the 1980s, right?
Since the 80s.
Since the 80s. We made a decision in the 1980s. We had a more manufacturing-based economy in Canada back then. We had, what we called the branch plant economy. We had lots of Canadian firms producing for the Canadian market. And we engaged in a tighter free trade agreement with the United States, largely aimed at solving sort of two economic and political problems. The economic problem was that Canada's natural resource exporters wanted better access to the U.S. market. We saw that as being, in particular, really beneficial to sectors like the oil and gas industry, to minerals, to, in theory, forestry. So this was seen as sort of a wise economic investment. But the trade-off we made there was that we removed protections for our own manufacturing bases in our economy. And it also solved some political problems for us because we had big regional differences over what the focus of national economic strategy should be in Canada. We're a highly provincialized country. We're a decentralized federation. And provincial leaders, I think, preferred the idea that we would just export natural resources to the United States and not give the federal government a big role in deciding who the winners and losers were in the Canadian economy. And, there's debates about how that's worked out for us up until this week. We have become a more natural resource-based economy over that time. And we have bet really big on the idea that those liberal markets would stay open. To the extent that's under threat now, this requires us to do a fairly deep kind of rethink. And this is why this conversation about what we can do to buy locally and sort of stimulate market development for locally produced products is really important. This is one of the things we can definitely do to strengthen our sort of resistance to the threat posed not only by U.S. trade action. I mean, I'll say the The president of the Association for Seafood Producers, this Jeff Loader, he made a really great point in the news a few days ago that really made me stand up at home. I think it was on this station. That to the extent that tariffs are now going to be used as a tool of foreign policy, foreign economic policy, which is foreign policy generally by the United States, they're going to be used by other countries, right? We run into this problem with Europe. We run into this problem with Japan. We run into this problem with all sorts of countries. The problem is we're export dependent. We're dependent on being able to sell things in other countries. So our bias towards that is so heavy in our economy. We have to find more ways to generate demand for the products we produce in Canada, inside Canada. That's a key response to this problem.
It also connects in with the retooling side of the economy that we have to really kind of look at. I remember in university, microeconomics professor gave me the text Small is Beautiful, Schumacher, 1971. And it was really around these, and it was interesting because by, young business student, really excited to kind of take over the world. And this text is really around the argument that economy should be at a human scale and that resources aren't in fact infinite when we put in the equation people and profit or people and planet. And, 1971. And it rings true today in the sense that we're in this moment where we realize, oh no, we're so dependent on other people. And when we think about if we lose economic power, there's a transaction to that in that policy. You can give your power perhaps away to the macroeconomic factors and foreign policy and all these things that perhaps maybe do we lose control over our future in the way that we want. That can be like on a certainly national perspective, but that transaction happens on a local level as well, even in our cities or our towns where when we don't necessarily prioritize the people, planet, self-sufficiency in localized economies, we actually create a greater dependency on things that we have no control over, which oftentimes hollows out the places in which we live.
So, Russell, what do you think this is when it comes to the relationship with the United States? And I mean, that's a big question. Yeah. But what are the implications here because this show we're talking about short, medium, long term, how we can adjust, right, for business. But then that relationship, things can always also depend on the relationship, short, medium, and long term, and what it can mean for the future and for like both countries.
You mean we could get back together again? Yeah.
Right. Like there might be a conscious uncoupling happening now, but maybe we get back to from frenemies to BFF down the road.
Yeah. I mean, personally, politically, I expect that to be almost inevitable, right? Geography is a big thing in economics, right? We're close together. We have resources the U.S. market needs. We already have vertically integrated supply chains for manufactured goods. You can Google. There's products that go into automobiles in North America that cross borders in North America 8 or 9 times, right?
Saw that a couple weeks ago in the New York Times piece, right?
Yeah, there's an inertia to that's really hard to overcome. But I think if we want to make sure that we get the best out of that relationship, we have to be more independent, right?
Yeah.
We can't even effectively pursue our own self-interest at the moment because we're not sort of insulated enough from the ability of the United States to use those levers against us to get better and better deals for themselves. So short, medium, long term, I think the strategy is all the same. We have to work on fostering a more integrated local economy and a more integrated national economy. I mean, we're talking about, buy local and the situation here in Newfoundland and Labrador today. There's things that we could get from Canada that we don't make locally that we also need to be integrating into that conversation. I'm always struck when I go in the NLC here, being from British Columbia. I grew up across the street from a winery.
The good wine doesn't make it over.
Well, I go in the liquor store here and, I'm all for wines of the world, to be frank. But I go in the liquor store here and there's wines from Washington and Oregon, but not from British Columbia.
Yeah.
Often when provinces engage in that kind of sort of discrimination against other Canadian goods, it's because they produce them locally. We don't even do that in Canada. We're not protecting a local wine industry.
No, there's not even a conversation.
It makes no sense. And these are the conversations we need to have. We need to address that. We are a community here in Newfoundland and Labrador. We depend on one another. We prosper and we sink together. But we also do with Canada. We pay more taxes to the federal government than we do the provincial government. When the economy is good elsewhere in Canada, that helps us here too, right? We're kind of all in this together. So, yeah, long-term, short-term, medium-term, it's all the same term. We need to foster more support for Canadian industry, local industry, and economic development.
Chelsey, you wrote a piece on LinkedIn, which was part of the planning for this show. Tell me about your thought process around, and then we can kind of dig into a bit for the piece.
Yeah. I think when I, like a lot of people sitting there yelling at their TVs, there's a sense of, I think, helplessness. It starts in helplessness because this is all unfolding in front of your eyes. And then there's a realization that there are, in fact, things we can do on a very personal level, on a community level, provincial, national. And I think my motivation was to kind of get those thoughts out of my brain and say, I really, a lot of my work has been in the social impact sector and social economy, solidarity economy in Quebec. And what all of that means is just thinking about the value that is generated when we buy stuff.
Yeah, and keeping the money in the bucket, right?
Keeping the money.
The Newfoundland and Labrador, as opposed to poking holes in it.
Yeah, and letting it circulate. Because and it's not always can you extract, this exponential value in every small thing you buy. But at the end of the day, that we don't actually factor in the true costs of the things we buy, of pollution, poor wages, resource depletion. That's not factored into, the broccoli we buy.
Yeah.
It's just driven by consumer prices. And so, in feeling that sense of helplessness, but then at the same time feeling, I think there are better ways to do things, but we also need the policy mechanisms by which to do them. We also need to lean into that entrepreneurial nature that isn't always, I think, obvious to us. It's not natural always to us. And start swinging big, taking some risks, and prioritizing the transaction of owning our economies, local ownership, what it means to be able to, I think, participate in a local economy that creates that value and allows those resources to really circulate within our communities. And I have to say, one of the things that has made me so hopeful in this conversation, as this has been unfolding for last week, is that people, regardless of political ideology, regardless of where they sit in terms of colors or parties or whatever, this real Team Canada thing has been actually quite inspiring to see, community action and citizen action happening around, buying local, made in Canada, difference between being produced in Canada, what it means to go to your farmer's market, and this is pretty interesting because normally, this conversation around, I think these types of local economies don't always get to the mainstream.
But we're having them now.
We have a moment to meet. And I would call in anybody who's an entrepreneur making stuff to really start thinking about how they meet this moment. This is an opportunity for them. So I actually think there's a lot of hope right now.
Folks, you're listening to The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. Today on the show we're marching our way through a 30-day reprieve, right? The pause button on the threat of U.S. tariffs. One part of this, the big part of the conversation, is there's a lot of uncertainty, right? And with the uncertainty, we're asking and talking about the shifting economic landscape in Newfoundland and Labrador. And we're asking, how should we adapt for the short, medium, and long term? The lines are open, 709-722-7111, 563-8255. You can text us 709-327-8206, the signal at cbc.ca. My two guests, political science professor Russell Williams and Chelsey MacNeil, CEO of the Purposeful Group, joining us now on the line. We've got Glenn Best from Fogo Island, fourth-generation fish harvester with decades of experience. Hi, Glenn. How you doing?
Hi, Adam. How are you?
Good, good. I got in touch with you because I wanted to talk to someone who does a fair bit of business with the U.S. So can you just explain a bit to folks about, if they don't know about you, just a bit about your operation?
Okay, yeah, sure. So we're a multi-generational family operation. Me and my brother. We have 4 vessels that we run out of Fogo Island, and we employ directly run just on the boats 18 guys. So we are I'd say the biggest harvester on Fogo Island of shellfish and other species as a family. So and of course that's a big contributor to Fogo Island in terms of an economic driver.
So, economic driver for Fogo. You've got that staff you mentioned, right? Multi-generation family for fish harvesting. What's this tariff threat ride been like for you guys?
Well, like I said to you earlier, when you called me earlier today, I mean, the fishery in general, every year it seems like it's turmoil. Yeah. But this year we had another element of the issue of tariffs, and it's it's very concerning to say the least, because you throw on a 25% tariff onto exports into the States. I mean, it's going to have a devastating impact on the Newfoundland fishery and our business, of course, because we've been so solely reliant on the U.S. for most of our fish products.
So the government of Newfoundland and Labrador is redirecting about $6 million to help the province's fishing industry explore diversified markets. And, as the threats of tariffs from the United States loom, I'm reading that directly from a CBC Newfoundland and Labrador piece from this week. What, in your experience, what does it like? There's money being spent on exploring diversifying markets. What's the reality of the difficulty of diversifying for someone like yourself and where your product goes?
Well, unfortunately, I think we've relied on the United States for. I mean, that's who takes most of our product, yeah. and I think we've taken that for granted, and we've been doing that for years. And in fairness, the United States is a culture that consumes a lot of shellfish, and shellfish right now is the biggest product of value that goes into the States. But unfortunately, we've relied on the States so much that I guess maybe we haven't looked at other places. So in order to change or pivot from the United States, I don't think it's realistic and nobody thinks that'll happen overnight, because I mean their culture, they consume a lot of shellfish. And to go other places is not something that's is a short-term fix. It's a long-term goal to diversify your markets and move out of the United States. So, right now it's not something that's I don't think it's realistic to say it's going to make a difference in the next year or even 2. So it's a longer-term goal.
Yeah, so that could be like a 5-year to 10-year strategy, sure. But so for you folks, what are you preparing for in the short term? Is it just trying to ride it out and hope for the best, or what is it?
Well, I guess basically that's pretty much it. Yeah. Right now, I mean, hopefully that the reprieve that Mr. Trump has given us on tariffs, Canada on the tariffs, so hopefully that that the politicians, the power to be, can work with the United States government and hopefully avoid tariffs, because right now I don't see what any viable options there are right now going forward in the short term. And like I said, unfortunately we've come to rely on the United States for most of our exports and fish products. So if you want to move to the European Union or places like that, I mean, they're not a culture that typically consumes a lot of, especially like shellfish when it comes to crab and stuff. And then the problem was places like Asia and the Japanese market. If they realize that we're under pressure in the U.S. market and prices are depressed, well, they use leverage, and that drives the price down on that side. So it's sort of a double whammy when it comes to comes to what you're going to get for your product.
Yeah, you're not in a good negotiating position if there's 25% tariffs on your product and you're going to, hoping to get further into the Japan market, given with them knowing that. No, of course, right? That would be rather difficult. Well, Glenn, I appreciate this chat. I'll keep my fingers crossed because that this is a real dollars and cents life, cost of living type stuff that's affecting everyone. So I appreciate you coming on the show.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thanks, Adam.
Cheers, Glenn. Glenn Best, they are fourth generation fish harvester on Fogo Island. So bring it back to the crowd here in the studio. Thoughts on what Glenn was saying, right? It's a short term, white knuckle it. 5 to 10 years, maybe we could probably, there's a chance to see some change for where product goes. But for now, it's like the stuff that's lined up is lined up.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there aren't a lot of options, right, in the short term. The only thing I would say, and I'll take it back to that sort of national kind of perspective, is, and we saw this during COVID, right? There were major changes in the seafood market as a result of people staying at home, right? There was a lot more demand in the United States for crab, for example, here from Newfoundland and Labrador. There's a lot of places in Canada. There's millions of Canadians that have never tried our fine shellfish, right?
Yeah.
You go in a major grocery store in Vancouver or Toronto, you can find shellfish from Alaska. You can find shellfish from Asia. You don't get local Newfoundland product there. I mean, as some sort of a cushion, at least in the short term, we need to work on that, right? We need to get those people thinking, I'm going to buy the Canadian alternative. And we need the grocery store chains, the private sector, to work with us on that. We need them to start prioritizing those products.
Chelsey?
Yeah, I also think we have to... This doesn't do good in the short term. But in the medium term, maybe long term, we have to stop waiting for things to cause us to act. Like when I think about diversifying these markets, Glenn's totally right. We're not in a good negotiating position because we've got this Damocles that's like really, that is causing us to have to pivot. And if we're thinking about on the policy side, like if we're thinking about this diversification and incentivizing this and working on the export side with in conjunction with what Russell's saying is like actually looking at our own domestic economy. If we're doing these things and it's not reactionary, it gives us better position, but it also diversifies the market base. And I think we often, if I think about all the things that have happened to us, and even the beginning of this conversation was about a bit of inertia on the economic policy front, that we have to wait for something to happen for us to react. When then that reaction is, putting a Band-Aid over a bullet hole. And I think that when we think if we are going to be, an entrepreneurial, innovative economy, then we have to start maybe having the policy environment to mobilize that.
Let's go back to the phones. We've got Mayor John Norman on the line from Bonavista. Hi, Mayor Norman. Thanks for coming on the show. I got in touch with you yesterday about coming on. How you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. Well, here's the same question I've been asking through the show. I mean, what's the conversation been on your end when it comes to these tariff threats?
Well, of course, there's a couple of different directions it's hitting us at the municipality. I also have been chairing the Regional Chamber of Commerce for a number of years. You've had callers already discussing the fishery. Bonavista and region employs hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in the fishery, license holders, people working in production, shipping, exporting, so on, predominantly to the U.S. as of now. And then you have a lot of those more artisanal makers, those manufacturers and exporters that Bonavista Peninsula has been quite known for. We're producing everything from beer to beds, salt, soap, coffee, silver jewelry, on up or down, all over the place.
And it's been a massive success story for Bonavista, right? This story of look at folks either moving home or newcomers coming in, setting up businesses, and now there's a big question mark over it.
Yeah, and I think a big part of that is going to be trying to open up markets within Canada as well for some of those smaller artisanal makers, breaking down barriers between provinces when you're looking at shipping out certain products. It has been in some cases that I've seen at the local level, shipping internationally is easier than selling to some other provinces and some other regions within the country. That's a real shame. The federal government has been discussing trying to break down those barriers. Premiers are now discussing it. So that's a really great discussion for now.
All right, so that's some of the approach, right? Let's talk about interprovincial trade and removing barriers, right? Get on that right away. What else do you think needs to happen for the short, medium, long term, especially for folks in and around the Bonavista area?
Depending on how this affects certain makers, certain exporters, I hope, and it seems that it's going to be the case, that the federal government, even in deficit situation, is going to have supports. I know that some have already been talking to funding agencies and federal government arms like ACOA, how this could affect them depending on what or what is not implemented. And I think the federal government is going to be there for a lot of those businesses to support them. For how long is the question, and what are the mechanisms they're going to put in place to secure those businesses long term? How are they going to pivot and export? And what is the role of the provincial and federal governments in supporting that, making that happen?
And whether it's with the chamber or as mayor, what's your role with, like, is it checking in with folks to see how they're doing and to make sure you talk about meetings that are had and communications that are happening? Like, what are you doing with folks in and around your community now with the threats in the air?
Well, there's a lot of anxiety, more than I think some people really realize, especially for those that are in some of those directly affected sectors, the fishery and small and medium-sized business that are manufacturing and generally exporting. People are also wondering now how this may or may not affect tourism. We all know the reaction that we're getting across Canada when we bring up Americans. Now at American sporting events, the Canadian national anthem is being booed in the last 48 hours. Those are customers that are coming into Canada, across Canada, and Newfoundland included. And how is that going to affect the feet on the ground customers as well for those brick and mortar locations that have front shops that rely on heavy sales for 4 or 5 months of the year to basically get them through the full year, and then export is only a part of their business. And we've got dozens of businesses like that in the region.
Oh, look, we had the show at Twinlygate this summer, and tour buses of American tourists of all political stripes, and I could tell about depending on what some of them were wearing, they were coming through. And yes, of course, if there's booze with the Canadian anthem at sports matches, right, whether it's hockey, whatever, or basketball, that the trickle-down effect of that could be real for the tourism industry here.
Well, we see the narrative on the national news and the American news, and there's a lot of misinformation we're seeing on the American side, but a large portion of the American population seems to be absorbing this information. And it's a lot of negative information about Canada, and we know it's not factual, but that can have a major ramification for our huge provincial and national tourism industry. So that's going to be an interesting conversation to be had in the coming weeks and months.
Mayor Norman, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to come back on the Signal. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers. That's Mayor John Norman of Bonavista there. So, well, folks, I will say the lines are open, right? As you're listening to this conversation today, we're talking about shifting how we do business in Newfoundland and Labrador and also across the country, right? Short, medium, long term. How should we adapt? Do you have thoughts or do you have questions for my guests? 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. Text us 709-327-8206, the signal at cbc.ca. What are the barriers for interprovincial trade? Quiz time. I'll say I was listening to a podcast a little while ago, and one of the big ones that came up that I heard was because they were talking about provinces getting together, and there's an issue for some parts of issues for interprovincial trade with language printing in Quebec and French and English, and that's been one of the big barriers. So there was also talk of like having other provinces get together first and then doing negotiations with Quebec afterwards. That kind of struck in my head, but that also seems like a solvable problem.
Yeah, I mean, so the thing I would say about this is we've had a national conversation about interprovincial trade barriers for, well, as long as I've been studying these things. But we don't tend to make a lot of progress on it because it hasn't been taken seriously, right? It hasn't sort of achieved the level of attention it needs to get properly addressed. A lot of it is a product of provincial rules like the ones you've just talked about. A lot of it is a product of the increasing sort of provincialization of our politics, the way that provinces are increasingly seen as sort of independent actors. I mean, I find some of the calls this week a little ironic. You know, the province of Alberta is calling on everyone to unify in building pipelines, et cetera, getting rid of, you know, that's their interpretation of an interprovincial trade barrier. This is a province that just passed a Sovereignty Act to insulate their economy from the rest of the country. So there's a bunch of different things going on there. The thing about the interprovincial trade barriers are a lot of them aren't really about trade. They're simply about government purchasing. They're about product standards. Those should be relatively easy things to eliminate, especially when the barriers aren't really protecting local industry, as I was talking about in relation to wine a few minutes ago. You know, Bonavista, they do make some great beer there. In fact, the Port Rexton Brewery makes 3 really great gluten-free beers that are great for people who have celiac problems. There's a national market for those products, right?
Yeah.
The fact that you can't sell those in other provinces, or it's not easy to sell those in other provinces because of how we do liquor distribution in this country, those are problems that could be solved, right? If we have the will to kind of address that.
I also think from a food, like just thinking more on the supply chain side of things in food. We do a lot of work in the Annapolis Valley around food systems. And one of the things that in Nova Scotia, and one of the things that like surprised me so much was that the bulk of the food that's produced in that region is exported. And if you're a small producer, that's where you get to connect in with a more domestic market. And what's fascinating to me is that we have so much, there is demand. There's demand on our grocery shelves. There's demand, you know, and so I wonder, like, once these trade, if we do get these interprovincial trade barriers, you know, get that out of the way, we also have to put pressure on the supply chains to start thinking differently about how the food gets into the food system. And that actually involves those corporations, the buyers, and ensuring that we are incentivizing that food to stay, and food, other products too, that we're getting them to the domestic market, because they can be, you know, subject to, you know, certainly the forces of the market. And if we want to kind of shift and retool, then we might have to incentivize that on a business level and on a corporate level.
Looking outside the country for a second, right? If we talk about, the outside the country diversifying for trade, there's an analysis piece by Peter Armstrong with CBC News that's up on the business page today. I think it's on the main page too. Anyways, if you Google Peter Armstrong and Trump trade threats, and you'll find it. It says Trump's trade threats are just the beginning. Canada needs to do more trade with the world. Problem is, global anti-trade rhetoric is rising.
Yep.
Yeah.
So there's also that outlook for us. It's like, oh, fine, we'll bring our business elsewhere, actually. And then, Peter Armstrong marches through France. You've got Marine Le Pen, right? It's called Globalization, Manufacturing by Slaves for Selling to the Unemployed, unquote. That's Marine Le Pen's statement there from France. The United Kingdom, Nigel Farage, right? Reform UK Party placed first for the first time ever in a poll released on Monday, squeaking ahead of the governing Labour Party. Farage, as many of you will know, folks, best known for campaigning for the UK to leave the EU's free trade zone Brexit. And there's a lot of thoughts on how that worked out. And also with India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi has become more protectionist with economies around the world too. And, you know, the analysis from Peter Armstrong goes on. We're in a tough spot.
There's no monopoly on dumb or lack of common sense in U.S. politics, right? It is a global phenomenon, and part of what I'm saying here today is it's a Canadian phenomenon as well, right? We've been doing it inside our own country for a while. This is a reality. This is why I keep saying strengthening the local economy is one of the most tangible things we can do.
And we can do it right away.
It has some voluntary dimensions to it, right? We have a lot of Canadians out there right now that are very keen to find out what they can do differently as individuals. Those kind of measures often aren't the best tool in public policy for making major economic changes, but it's a step, and it can help address some of what you were just alluding to, the idea that we have to actually show the private sector that there's demand for Canadian products inside Canada, and they need to start putting it on the shelves all across the country. We need Canadians to actually mobilize themselves.
Yeah. Every dollar is a vote for the economy you want. And I think we all have a real role to play in that. And I would call on, from a policy lever on the procurement side of things, we have institutions, hospitals, schools, offices, businesses that procure billions of dollars of goods. And if we are thinking about prioritizing how we do that procurement using those levers, I think we also have some demand that we can also better utilize to get that economy we want, which is a strong local, interprovincial economy. And if we're using those tools, there's a lot we can do.
We just got an email in from Vicky Reutner, who's in Aurora, Ontario. Shout out to the Aurora listeners of the Signal. Thanks for listening, Vicky. Vicky says, I left Newfoundland and Labrador and have been living in Ontario since 1989. And I can never understand why I couldn't buy seafood from NL at the local large chain supermarkets. When I'm back home in NL on summer holidays, I can't understand how places like Costco sell fruits and vegetables from the USA rather than produce reach Ontario. Perhaps this will change. And it goes to this interprovincial trade, buying Canadian discussion. I've found too, right, as someone I've lived in South Korea, I've lived in Japan, where there's massive seafood markets, people are eating seafood that from international and locally caught seafood a lot over the years here. I think we're doing a little better now, but like a little better. Getting local seafood is not as easy as some folks from who don't live here think it is sometimes too. Which is, again, if we're buying local, right? Yeah.
I also think we underestimate the customer a little bit. And in terms of, always that price is king. And we have to recognize there's an affordability crisis.
Cost of living crisis happening, yes. We're living through it.
It's very real. I do think there's that meeting the moment is very real. Like, when we think about how we purchase locally, we can do well on. We can compete when we're buying in season. We can compete when we're shortening supply chains and shoring up how the distribution happens. Because when there's less actors in the mix, there's closer you get to the consumer, potentially, the more affordable the price. Not always. And we have to, and that's part of breaking down all these barriers and systems that we've put in place. I think COVID-19 exposed these weaknesses in the system, in our economy, majorly. And we saw there was opportunity that also came out of the pandemic. I don't know if we fully stayed the course, though, following that, and because we saw it show up, on food, medical supplies, essential goods. We saw all that, the weaknesses in all those supply chains. And we saw a need, if you recall, we had, the Newfoundland distillery making hand sanitizer. Like, we responded in a very agile, quick way on a bunch of fronts. Like, shout out to the work of Task Force NL on medical supplies. And I wonder, we met that moment, but we didn't stay there. And I wonder if this is another moment that the call is like, maybe we need to meet the moment, but also make the policy changes and the culture shifts in which to meet this moment and stay here.
Well, yeah, that was one of the questions I was about to ask. So I'm glad you brought it up about the pandemic, right? That pandemic word of pivot that was used so often. And as yes, we're still marching through that. It's not finished, but for the beginning and the response and everything that happened from 2020 onward. So, Russell, to you, do you think this has then equipped us a bit better for what's to come? Because even though we didn't stay, like Chelsey's saying, on some of that course, the fact that we did have a time of hey, we actually have to change because we're being forced to.
Yeah, it's the problem is people interpret the pandemic so differently based on.
That is very true. I've seen differences of opinion on it.
Based on partisan ideas about politics. But I would say it is absolutely the case that we adapted to a difficult situation very quickly, as we have done in the past in this country when we've had to. We do have options. We can do things differently. We are not stuck in this place. But we have to have leadership that wants to do it, that wants to take Canadians in that direction, right? So that's a big piece at the moment too. We need provincial governments and the federal government to step up right now and meet this moment.
And just a funny example, I was talking with my daughter, who's 12, about what was happening and in relation to the tariffs and whatever, and how that would show up in kind of our household. And I said to her, so, we might not be drinking orange juice next week at breakfast. And she turned to me and she said, well, we've got lots of apple juice. And I went, yes, we do. And apples are made in were grown in Nova Scotia for the whole country and. So even, my beautiful, bright 12-year-old is saying, I know what a substitute is from an economic standpoint.
Great point.
And it's a really, we're, as customers, again, we vote for the economy we want with every dollar we spend. Mm-hmm. And I think we're more agile, and I think we're more entrepreneurial than we ever give ourselves credit for.
So how do we feel about the response so far that we're seeing, whether federally, provincially, because there's that whole, you've alluded to it already with the Team Canada approach, but Alberta has not quite been on, there's different ideas from the Alberta government on the Team Canada approach. Daniel Smith being down at Mar-a-Lago. Mm-hmm. Then you've got Premier Andrew Furey here. Doug Ford in Ontario has been very wearing hats and stuff about Team Canada. So what are your thoughts?
I think at the public level, right, the response has been great, right? It's,
lots of talking, looking ahead, trying to be positive about how do we take control of our destiny for what we can.
My kids weren't thrilled with the threat that Netflix was going to go, to be perfectly honest, because some things we don't seem to have clear substitutes for, although somewhat.
I just want to say CBC Gem.
I was working up to a plug there. I'm trying to do plugs today.
This is really good. You're the right guest for the right moment, Russell.
I think the public's been great, right? I do think, though, that our political kind of infrastructure and our information systems are kind of always working to pull us apart, right? For perfectly obvious reasons. Partisanship, our partisan political system requires people to disagree in order. I mean, that's the political fuel. That's what drives politics.
Yeah, it's adversarial. That's the whole thing with it.
So there's some of that going on. Like, we do have a serious question at the moment about who's going to lead the country going forward this year. That hangs over all of this. That's a big issue. The extent to which the provinces can work together, I've already alluded to that. I think that's a huge question, and I would really like to see the provinces change the conversation about that. But it is also the case, just from an organized interest perspective, a crisis is always seized on, and every group sees that crisis as an opportunity to advance the solution that they've recommended in response to every other crisis since, the dawn of time. People have pre-existing ideas about what they want. Surprise, surprise, it's usually the thing that fits their own interests, right? And we kind of need to see that for what it is at the moment, too. There's some things being recommended that probably aren't as important. And are maybe a bit of a distraction. Starting to talk about, like the issue of language in Quebec, I think the reason we see those things is because it's divisive, right?
Yeah.
Because it raises the ire of people that are mad about things politically. I think what I'd really like to see from the political leadership in the country is to be where the public's at. And I think that's what we need to expect from our governments right now.
There's something. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chelsey.
Yeah, I was just going to say, before this crisis with the tariffs came forward, I was having a conversation with a colleague, and we were saying, the divisiveness that we're in right now, federally speaking, is beware, it's a trap. Like the divisiveness, the things that divide us, is a trap for us to end up in one side or another. Well, we know that the answers to any challenge that we're having is somewhere in the middle, is in the sticky middle bits. And this idea of dividing us is really we end up in. I think we end up with the emotional side of the political landscape, as opposed to thinking what's good for Canadians, for your communities, for your provinces, what have you. And one of the things I like about the response, both federally, provincially, I feel like we've kind of cut through that a little bit. I mean, I get very, very sad when I think about the divisive nature of climate change right now in the public discourse. Whether you believe in carbon tax, not carbon tax, none of that really matters. At the end of the day, we still have climate change and we still have to do something about it.
Yeah.
And I think this crisis that we're in right now, at least we're not kind of thinking about this or that. And I do think that's not permeating through the public discourse right now federally, that we have this sort of this or that. It's really that pulling together approach, which I'd like to see that type of leadership continue. And I'd like to see the policy response to support the strategy. So I'd like to see the policy response. If you care about local economies, community development, community ownership, entrepreneurial communities, then you gotta. Now we've talked about it, but now we have to create the strategies and policies that are gonna support it. And so. Stay tuned on how that translates in terms of making it happen. But I'm optimistic that we have a level of pulling together that's not and we're away from a moment that was, I think, pulling us apart.
I do. This comes up a lot whenever I do tech shows, right? The folks in the industry talk about, well, it's a bit easier in Newfoundland and Labrador because you're pretty much a phone call away from anyone, right? If you want to get in touch with them. And I find out some of this policy level, like back on Jan 23, we did a show on tariffs, right? So here in this room, we had Chelsey MacNeil, right, from Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labor, Dwan Street from the FFAW, Anne-Marie Boudreau, CEO of the Board of Trade, and Tom Cooper, MUM Business Prof. And these are folks who are going to have different ideas and different things. But everyone was talking together. And the day before I did a show on immigration, and it was similar voices. Anne-Marie Boudreau was on both shows. You had similar voices kind of in a way rowing in that same direction, saying, like, we got to be together on this. And this is something that has struck me with this conversation locally for Newfoundland and Labrador, of you getting some pretty important voices out there in the community with a fair bit of togetherness on where we're going. So that, I think, is an encouraging sign, perhaps. So then so Russell, then whether what you're teaching or anything, like, how is it, what are you telling your students around this? Like, is this because I always find poli-sci prof so interesting because it's like you'll do a show like this, you're paying attention, and then you're back in the classroom talking about stuff. Like, what is it with the students on this?
There's a lot of great teachables at the moment,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So if you're teaching trade policy at the moment, there's some. It's easy to capture the imagination about why some stale old debates about protectionism and free trade and strategic trade theory and even how a tariff works. Those things are great. But in particular, in this context, there are so many additional public policy issues raised at the moment by this discussion. And I think the crucial one is, you raised it off the top. It's the Trump administration's ability to get things to the top of the sort of issue agenda, to gain the public's attention, to mobilize it around things that they want to talk about in that moment. We could all take a page out of that book, right? That's kind of where we need to be in this country at this moment about this problem. We need to keep this at the top of the public agenda, and that requires that kind of attention.
Chelsey MacNeil, getting down to final thoughts. We'll go back to you and then back to Russell if we got time. Final thoughts for today.
Yeah, I think on twofold. If I think about from a business lens, I do think local entrepreneurship, I think entrepreneurial communities is really important. I think thinking about ownership, like who owns what, really matters in terms of how an economy grows and evolves. But from a policy perspective, I would also say we need to invest in small business. We need to invest in communities. We need to invest in that community development. On the other side of it, consumers, be mindful what you spend. Go and find the alternatives. I think, and for those who don't necessarily see themselves as entrepreneurial but have lots of ideas that start at the kitchen table, don't let them die at the kitchen table. See what's next. If you have a good idea, go and find some support to figure it out.
Final thought, Russell, about 15, 20 seconds.
Because we're a natural resource-dependent economy, we haven't been very entrepreneurial in the past. That's a reality, and that's one of the things that needs to change.
Russell Williams, Chelsey MacNeil, thank you so much for this. All right, folks, that is it for today's show. I don't know about you, but the end of 2024 and the start of 2025, news, it's been a lot. So tomorrow, we're taking the foot off the gas for some radio R&R. It's the first Friday of the month, so it is Trivia Day tomorrow on The Signal. John Gushu will be by. It is stress-free, 55 minutes of radio, I promise you. The only thing stressful is trying to figure out what the answer is to John's questions. And as always, send us emails, thesignal@cbc.ca. Thanks for listening.